Hey everybody, Doomwake here, and welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online results, some paper events when those are applicable, and we take a look and see what's happening in the metagame. Take a look at Modern, Pioneer, and Standard. Well, I guess as of the time of when I created the weekly series, the three most relevant competitive formats. Now, I guess only two of those are relevant, but, we're still taking a look at Pioneer just to do a weekly check-in and see how everybody's doing over there. And with Modern being the current RCQ season and Standard being the focus for the upcoming set of regional championships, two of which I will be attending. I'll be at Minneapolis leaving next Friday, and then I'll be in Hartford as well, which is, I believe, mid-May. So a lot of things to pay attention to. And we are going to start things off, as we always do, with the Modern format. And you take a look and you compare it to last week, Boros Energy, still the best deck. 25.4% of the metagame, a full quarter of the metagame, up roughly about 6% from last week's 19.5. There's not really a lot to say about Boros. I would take a look at a list, but I did, if you go back and check last week's episode, we talked about Boros Energy with Voice of Victory. That seems to be the only new card. I believe there was only one singular list that I saw that featured Cori-steel Cutter. Might be worth exploring. The issue is the Boros deck's curve is a little bit higher, so nothing like Bauble or any other free spells to trigger Cutter. So not as good in the Boros deck, but I am still convinced that Voice is extremely good in that deck. Tamir Murktide, roughly about the same. Mono Blue Belcher, relatively big downtick, which surprises me with how much Boros there is. That traditionally has been an incredible matchup for Mono Blue Belcher against Boros Energy, so a little surprised to see a downtick in that. If you're going to a local RCQ and you have a ton of Boros Energy in your area, I can't imagine you can do much better than Belcher against that deck. Is it prowess from 6.6 to 7.1? Slight uptick, although that's not exactly... There was one paper event, but I was going to cover it, but it was impossible to find deck lists. Or I was going to include it in this data, but I could not find deck lists. But I did see a metagame breakdown, and I believe it was 15-ish% Boros, 10% prowess at the second most deck, which was kind of crazy to see prowess be the second most played deck. But that's kind of what we have here, right? It's at least pretty close. And then everything else is just kind of fighting for second place here. Brood-scale combo, Gruul Eldrazi, which most, if not all of them, have incorporated Ugin. A little bit of Affinity, a little bit of Orzhov, a little bit of Ruby Storm, and yeah, that's pretty much it. It's really just Boros at the top, and then everybody else is fighting for that second place. I guess leaning towards Dimir Murktide, Izzet Prowess, and Brood-scale combo, but, everything else is in that 3 to 4% range, so relatively healthy once you get past Boros. But as you can see in the winners column, we have two challenges that were won by Jeskai Prowess, not Energy. And that is where we are going to start taking a look at deck lists. Now, you take a look at this, and you might think to yourself, well, this really hasn't changed that much from the Prowess list that we saw last week. The big difference here is the addition of the white cards in the main deck and the sideboard. So both Prismatic Ending is in the main deck as a 4 of, and Chain to the Rocks in the sideboard also as a 4 of. The white cards, I think, really give this deck a new dimension, where I have played a decent amount of the Prowess deck against Energy, and I feel like the Prowess deck is relatively far behind Energy, just simply due to the presence of Flage. You can play a long game with Cutter, and you can, assuming that the Boros player doesn't have one of their static prisons, you can continuously keep putting threats in the battlefield. But that stuff just doesn't really compete with Flage. So if you have a consistent answer to Flage in the form of Prismatic Ending and then Chained in the sideboard games, I could see that helping a lot. And one of Boros's only answers to your Cutter is the Static Prison, and Prismatic Ending answers that pretty cleanly. Now, I will say that with stuff like Prismatic Ending, you are definitely being a little bit, it's the best way to put this, you're not as aggressive, right? Because you're playing a more reactive card over additional free spells and burn spells. So you're generally going to play a little bit more of a longer game. That's why you see the previous list that I played last week had 17 lands. We're now up to 19, and we've switched Slickshot Show Off for Soulscar Mage because, again, Slickshot's all about killing them fast with mutagenic growth and stuff like that. Soulscar is just a more, I'm not trying to say it's a better card, because it's definitely not better, but if you are playing a little bit of a longer game, Soulscar kind of gives you this weird, like, the counters matter in a longer game, so that's kind of the idea there, I think, and then additional lands to support Flage. But yeah, interesting take on the Prowess deck. I do think the white cards do make you a little bit better against Boros Energy, so we'll have to see how that plays out. All right, now for a little bit of spice. From Eddie Plays MTG, in 22nd place, we have Mono Red as Miranda Mardukast and a Kuldakar, but we're not actually Mono Red. We are Rakdos. And you kind of have the same core of Asmo, the Underworld Cookbook, pairing with Monument to Endurance, and then Oval Chase Daredevil to keep going, and then Faithless Looting to enable Asmo, right? So you have that kind of discard package and discard core. You're pairing that with both Urza Saga and Mox Opal, because Opal is a busted card. A Cookbook makes you a lot of game objects that turn on Mox Opal, and Saga is also a busted card that finds Cookbook. But as our secondary engine, rather than just kind of play more removal spells and try to play a bit more of an interactive game, we're just playing 4 Archon of Cruelty and 4 Persist. And honestly, I kind of like that, because the biggest problem with these Asmo Monument decks is they feel so good against the other fair decks, but they just don't have a way to, like, they don't have a nut draw. And it feels like if you're playing a deck in Modern right now, you have to have some sort of nut draw to be able to compete with the other combo decks. And turn 2 Archon of Cruelty can do that. You can go persist on 1, or excuse me, looting on 1, persist on 2, go from there. So at least a more aggressive take on these mono red Asmo decks, and one that I think maybe has some legs. I finally found some new cards. From Helvetii in 31st place. So this is Hollow One. So if you guys haven't seen this deck before, it's utilizing, you guessed it, Faithless Looting to draw discard cards. Who knew? Faithless Looting, not that bad. Small tangent, I've found it really interesting that when Breach got banned, we kind of reverted back to December of last year when they initially unbanned Looting and Opal, and everybody was like, oh, my new cool, my Faithless Looting deck from 5 years ago, or my Opal deck from 6 years ago got unbanned. Breach kind of just made those irrelevant, but we're kind of like reliving the unban process in a way, which I find kind of interesting. But going back to this deck, so you have the 4 Marauding Makos. There are no copies of Flameblade Adept, which is a card that I've been liking in these decks to give you additional 1-drops. Again, have those nut draws. More 1-drops makes Arena a lot better, so I prefer the Flameblades. But I wanted to highlight this because it's playing a new card, Winternight Stories, which is 3 mana, draw 3, discard a creature, or discard 2. You might think to yourself, well, 3 mana for a draw discard, it's a little pricey, right? However, if you discard the Winternight Stories to, say, a Burning Inquiry or a Looting, you can harmonize it from the graveyard for a single mana by tapping either Mako or Hollow One. You don't necessarily want to tap the creature that you're attacking with, but if you, say, Burning Inquiry, keep a Hollow One, discard a Stories, play the Hollow One for free, you're not attacking with it that turn, use the Hollow One to then use the Winternight and kind of go from there. So may not be that good, but potentially worth trying. And last but certainly not least, from frequent appearance on the channel, Screenwriter NY just keeps banger after banger. So this is Storm Scale Scion Storm. Anyways, you're essentially still doing the Ruby Medallion Ral Monsoon Mage stuff. If you remember, a few weeks prior when I highlighted a Screenwriter NY Storm deck list, like right when the set dropped, they were playing Baral with, I think it was Baral and Ruby Medallion. They cut the Rals. We're back on the Rals, which I like. I think Ral's better. But we are still playing a lot of blue cards. So we have the Rituals that you're probably used to. Spell Snare in the main deck, X3, really good against Boros, even good against Eldrazi to counter Talisman and Rumble. Teferi Time Raveler to stop your opponent from, well, not only stop your opponent from countering you, also remove hate permanents, right? Stuff like Deafening Silence or Damping Sphere or Magebane Lizard. Teferi just answers all of them. So that's kind of cool. And then the other blue cards here, you have Preordain, which cantrips and helps you find your combo, and Stock Up, which is just one of the best cards in Magic right now. So you'll notice there's no Past in Flames, right? There's still 2 Wish and the 1 Past in Flames, but you're not like a Past in Flames main deck like traditional Ruby Storm. It's more of just, here's like 3 or 4 dragons on turn 2 or turn 3 and give you a turn. It's not like, you still can do that because you have Wish, Past in Flames, Grape Shot, but I think you're going to be making a lot of dragons and passing a good amount of the time, which, not sure if that's where you want to be, but you definitely have more card advantage in this version. Remember that format that we talked about in the intro that used to be a competitive format? Pioneer players are, I don't know. I just don't know right now. So if you guys don't remember, 2 weeks ago, when we looked at the data, Mono Red Mice was roughly around 31% of the metagame. It went down significantly, down to 20.6 from last week. We're back up to 26.9. What are we doing? With a card pool as large as Pioneer, there's got to be something that's good against these stupid mice. So yeah, Mono Red Mice still dominating. However, huge uptick in Phoenix, and we're going to talk about why in a second. Maybe has to do with some new cards. Phoenix went from 6.9 to 16.9, a full 10% increase in the metagame, putting it in second. Demons, third, a little bit behind that. Jun's Sacrifice, a little bit of an uptick. Not going to look at a Jun's Sacrifice deck list because they're still the same as they were 3-4 months ago. But I think that is one of the few decks that is good against Mono Red. And maybe these newer builds of Phoenix can be good against it as well. Rakdos Demons, Rakdos Prowess. I will say, I think basically every single Rakdos Prowess list that I looked at had Cutter. Not all of them had 4. I think they were in like the 2 to 3 range, but I'm pretty sure they all had Cutter. Cori-steel Cutter, that is. Dimir Ninjas, Azorius Control, that's kind of where you get to the dregs over there. But yeah, the format right now is just Mice, tier, S tier, whatever you want to call it. And then Phoenix is like maybe in its own tier below that, and then everything else is below that. So that's where we're at. However, one of the winners of the challenges this weekend was Celestia Cage, and I would be remiss if I did not talk about a Celestia Cage deck that won a challenge, and not just a Celestia Cage deck, a Celestia Cage deck featuring 3 copies of Craterhoof Behemoth. Somehow this is a green card. It definitely looks like teal or aqua or blue to me, but anyways, Craterhoof is now legal in Standard, which therefore means that it's also legal in Pioneer. So if you want to do some Cage stuff, maybe some Elf stuff, that could be something. My initial impression when I tried Craterhoof Behemoth in the Standard version of Cage was it felt unnecessary. And what I mean by that is, yeah, it definitely does win you the game, like every single time when you get to put it under a cage. The issue is you can't do anything with it if you draw it. Like, it is nearly impossible to cast. Now, I will say the Pioneer version, because you're playing 8 copies of Llanowar Elves with 4 Elvish Mystic as well, is potentially more likely to be able to hardcast it because you have more mana, more just pure mana sources. So it's possible that it's more likely or realistic in this version. But other than that, we have 2 Elspeth Stormslayer as additional new cards. And then it's kind of just normal Cage stuff, right? The 8 Elves. 4 Innocence main deck is a little surprising. That's the 3-drop of choice. Well, I guess we have a lot more 3s. We have 4 Paw Patch, 2 Sandstorm, 4 Sanguine Evangelist, and 2 Voice of Resurgence. And then 4 copies of Emiria's Call. And one last note about this deck. Emiria's Call is fantastic because it's a land that goes into your land slot, but is also just a good hit off Cage. Making 2 4/4 flyers, not that bad. How about that Phoenix deck? So this is what Phoenix... I shouldn't say what Phoenix looks like, because at least from the lists that I was looking at, it seemed to be relatively split. I want to say less than half of them had Cori-steel Cutter. It might have been closer to like 30 or 35%. So somewhere in that range of these Phoenix decks had Cori-steel Cutter. Now you might ask yourself, what are they cutting for the cutters? From one of the lists that I saw that got first place, which didn't have Cutter, the cards that got removed were a Temporal Trespass, a Galvanic Relay iteration, whatever the copy is. I know there's a lot of Galvanics. The Copy Spell, the Time Walk, Brazen Borrower, and then 1 Profs. Those 4 cards got cut for 4 cutters. Basically, everything else was the same. Nothing else has really changed. So and I think that's interesting because I do like the fact that obviously Cutter plays fantastically with a bunch of cantrips. And what I like about it is it gives you a reliable backup plan when your graveyard is under siege, which happens very frequently, especially in a lot of post-board games. Now, I don't know if that means that you want to main deck the Cutters or if it's more of a sideboard juke against the graveyard hate. But, I mean, there are some decks that play main deck graveyard hate, so having access to them in game one is not that bad. But yeah, the rest is pretty much the same. Phoenixes, Pranksters, Talents, Cantrips, Treasure Cruise, all that stuff. Just wanted to show you what a version of Phoenix looks like with Cutter and talk about what they've removed to make room for the Cutters. How about some spice? So when I initially saw this deck list, I had not even registered that it was a Yorion deck, and I was like, looking through all these cards, and I asked myself, how did they make room for all of this stuff? And then I looked at the total number of cards and I said, oh. So this is Demons, but not really Demons. So this is Grixis Demons. So you still have Archfiend of the Dross, Blade of the Oni, Blood Tithe Harvester, Unholy Annex, Fatal Push, no Thoughtseize, which is a little surprising. They're in the sideboard. So you still have that core of demons, right? But we're playing some more cards that are good with Enter the Battlefield effects because we're a Yorion deck. So we have the aforementioned Harvesters, we have Fear of Missing Out, we have Fable the Mirror Breaker, Hopeless Nightmare, Momentum Breaker, Prophecy Eidetic Memory, just a bunch of stuff and things that you can do with Yorion. You can even reset Unholy Annex, which is kind of cool. And on top of all of that, because we're playing blue for Yorion, we might as well just add another combo to our deck. So for people who don't know this combo, if you have an Archfiend of the Dross in play, and they have, I don't know, any creature, you pick. You can have any creature you want, as long as it doesn't have Shroud or Hexproof. You metamorphic alteration onto their creature. Their creature now becomes a copy of Archfiend of the Dross. The funny thing about Archfiend is the only time that it gets the oil counters is when it enters the battlefield. So, if you make their card a copy of an Archfiend of the Dross with no oil counters, you pass the turn to them, and in their upkeep, they have an Archfiend with no oil counters on it, so they lose the game on the spot. So I think that's kind of cool and gives you a way to race the other aggressive decks and other combo decks. But yeah, interesting take on demons. 80 cards is a little sus, but I mean, you got to find a way to make room for everything, right? All right, last deck we're going to take a look at here from Half Calf Jason. This is Orzhov Ketramos. Now, I have seen some people try Ketramos in Pioneer before, mostly to not the best success, but this list looks a little bit more promising to me. So you have a bunch of ways to trigger Ketramos, like Portable Hole, exile a creature they control, Trespasser, which enters the battlefield and attacks, gets to trigger Ketramos on your turn. You have Gurmag Angler, Delve, also triggers Ketramos. Bailmerk to help find you these particular pieces and find the Ketramos itself, which I think is kind of cool. You have Anoint with Affliction, Cling to Dust, March of Otherworldly Light, Vanishing Verse, Wandering Emperor, Dreams. So tons and tons of ways to trigger Ketramos that are not abnormal magic cards. They're just removal spells and stuff you would normally want to play like Graveyard Trespasser. So you're not going out of your way to trigger Ketramos, and I think that is the important part. I've seen a lot of people just like trying to do backflips and go through all these hoops to trigger Ketramos, and like the reality is you can just be a mid-range deck that plays a bunch of cards that you would normally want to play with Ketramos. So very good looking list from Jason. And with that, let's put a wrap on Pioneer and switch over to Standard. Now, if you thought Modern and Pioneer were one deck formats, Standard is all over the place right now. And this is the funniest time for the metagame to be shifting like this right before we have, as of the time of recording, I believe Bologna RC is this weekend, and then Minneapolis RC is the weekend after. So great time to be just completely shifting all of my RC testing. But in any case, this is what the metagame looks like. So, I mean, looking at this chart, it's pretty healthy, right? 10% Esper Pixie down from 15, 10% Prowess down from 13, Mono Red Aggro 9.4 down from 10.6, a small amount. Azorius Omniscience, huge uptick. Jeskai Oculus, massive uptick. Jeskai Control, massive uptick. Azorius Control. Control decks took up, if you want to lump Jeskai, well, I guess Jeskai was higher anyways, but if you lump Jeskai and Azorius Control at 17%, Control was the most played deck in these challenges. So yeah, Oculus in first, Jeskai Control in second, Pixie and Prowess kind of tied for third. So metagame is really, really shifting. And I think that is a natural response to how dominant Prowess was last week. Now, I say dominant was only 13.1% of the metagame, but it was just, I was winning everything when I was playing Prowess on at least Arena. And I think the natural response to that is play some temporary lockdowns, which you see Jeskai Control and Azorius Control. Those are probably the two best lockdown decks. Azorius Omniscience, you guessed it, another 4 main deck lockdown decks. So it's not surprising to see these decks doing well. Now, the question is, how does Izzet Prowess respond to all the lockdowns? And that is a question that we might answer right away. And here we have it. So first place in the Sunday challenge. This was the most recent challenge as well. I don't want to call this Izzet Prowess because it's not a Prowess deck. I labeled this as Izzet Cutter. So essentially what we've done here from Aussie51, shout out to Aussie51, Tim in the Twitch chat. I'm sure if you're watching, you'll like the shout out. But what we've done here is we have taken the Prowess deck and we've removed basically all of the cards that are bad against lockdown, with the exception of the best card in the deck, Cori-steel Cutter, of course. So no more Swift Spears, no more Slick Shots. You still have talents, right? There's still 4 Storm Chasers, but even if they lock down your talent, it's really just a 1-for-1. And if you ever get to level it before they lock down it, whatever. And we've replaced those with sticky threats. Hearth Elemental, which is a card you're seeing more and more in the just traditional Prowess decks, which is a 4/5 for 6 that costs 1 less for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard. But you can also have this sorcery angle where you pay 2 mana, discard your hand, draw 2. So it gives you good double spell turns for Cutter, because when you're empty-handed, you can play the spell half of this, and then later on, you have a 1 mana creature to trigger Cutter. And then Pauper Staple, Talarian Terror. Usually you see this in conjunction with the Eddie Mer Crab, kind of this 8 package, 8 Terror Crab, whatever you want to call it, in the Simic deck. But turns out if you just cast a bunch of spells, it's just a good threat. And this deck is looking to cast a ton of spells. And then really, I mean, you have a lot of the same stuff that Prowess does, right? 4 Burst Lightning, 4 Opt, 4 Sleight of Hand. You even have more cantrips in the form of Unending Whisper, which is just 1 mana draw card. And you can harmonize it, which sounds like this doesn't come up very often, but it actually does, because you have Terror and Hearth Elemental to discount the harmonize. Get a couple of towns, couple of torches, a Braids main deck for opposing cutters. I don't know. I'm going to have to give this one a try. I'm a little skeptical of only 2 stock up, because I do think this is the best card in every Izzet deck that I've played. So I would highly recommend probably playing 4 copies, maybe cutting the Dragon Hunt and the stories. But other than that, this deck looks clean. I'm going to have to give it a shot. We're not going to be looking at a lot of spice today, but I wanted to showcase you guys, especially for people that are preparing for Bologna this weekend and Minneapolis next weekend. I wanted to show you guys what the metagame, like what the most popular decks look like. So this is Jeskai Control, 3rd place from Scipios. I typically am not a huge fan of control decks, but I will say every time I've played against this Jeskai Control deck, it has just looked so good. And I do think I would lean towards Jeskai over Blue-White, simply for the fact that Shiko is just a ridiculous Magic card. Every time you get to go Shiko, flashback a stock up, it's not only do you get this huge flying body that doesn't die to nowhere to run, doesn't die to burst lightning kicked, like it's really hard for a lot of decks to kill this. It has vigilance, so you can play offense and defense, and you just get to cast stock up. So, and it's also a dragon for your exhales, which, you know, that there's that as well. The main deck lockdowns, 4 Lightning Helix. I think that's a really good choice right now, too. That's another good reason to be playing Jeskai over Blue-White. But yeah, I mean, the Revelations, could take or leave. I mean, this versus some other big, expensive sorcery instant or planeswalker is like kind of marginal. But you have the Regions, too, which are pretty good. 1 Rediscover the Way, and then a bunch of kill spells. So the 1 Chandra as well, which is kind of interesting. So this is what Jeskai is looking like. Again, I think I'd prefer Jeskai over Blue-White if you're playing a control deck, so keep that in mind. And then the other kind of big deck that I wanted to highlight is the Jeskai Oculus deck. So this would be my preferred version of Oculus. I know there is a very, very hot debate between Marauding Mako and Spyglass Siren. If you have Fear of Missing Out, Steam Core Scholar, Tursa, Glacial Dragon Hunt, Winter Night Stories, if you have these cards in your deck, just play Mako. I understand that there's going to be games where Mako looks embarrassing, but the reality of the fact is, Standard is all about just who can nut draw better, right? And in the best case scenario, Mako is going to be a 4/4 on turn 3. You play it on 1, you go Fear on 2, Tursa, Steam Core, any one of your 3 drops on turn 3, and you're attacking for 4. So I would definitely play the Makos. Worst case, you can just cycle them later on if you draw them. It's fine. Not that big of a deal. But I do like this kind of core. I'm not sure I like Kitsa over the second Inti. I think I'd maybe prefer a second Inti there, but all these other numbers look good. 3 Scholar, 2 Tursa. Love that split. 3 Profs, 2 Pierce. I know some people go 4 Profs, 1 Pierce. I like 3/2. 2 Winter Night, 2 Recommission, 2 Dragon Hunt. All these numbers look fantastic. The only thing I think I would do is cut Kitsa for Inti. Send it if you're an Oculus player. It's a good list. And I mean, I think Oculus is sneakily a good choice for the RCs this weekend. I did tell you there wouldn't be any spice, and I don't really know if you want to call this deck spicy, but there have been a lot of Orzhov versions of Pixie popping up over the past week or so, ever since the Resurgence of Prowess. And honestly, I'm not surprised, because I do genuinely think this is the deck. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that this is the best deck that has temporary lockdown. I think that title probably goes to Jeskai Control. What I am trying to say is that this deck utilizes lockdown in a way that no other deck can, specifically because you have 4 Nurturing Pixie and 4 Sun Pearl Kirin. Now, before these Orzhov lockdown decks, if you wanted to set up the lockdown loop, you really did have to play 3 colors with Town and stuff like that. But now that you have Kirin, you actually can just, okay, so if you have a Kirin under a lockdown, right? You play Pixie, you pick up the lockdown, right? The Kirin comes back into play. The Kirin returns the Pixie to your hand. Now you have set up a spot where you have Kirin in play, Pixie lockdown in hand. You get all the other triggers from Hopeless Nightmares, Nowhere to Runs, Breakers, all that stuff. And then you play the lockdown again, lock everything else up, play the Pixie, pick up the lockdown. And that's what I mean by the loop. You can keep looping Hopeless Nightmare, Breaker, Nowhere to Run, all of that stuff infinitely once you have those 2 pieces. But you couldn't do that before because Nurturing Pixie can't return other Nurturing Pixies. So Kirin was the missing piece for a deck like this. All of this stuff like Nightmare, Breaker, Nowhere to Run, I would play 4 Temp Lockdown, I think. The big issue for me with this deck is trying to find what the alternate threat is. Some people play Preacher, some people play Overlord Scroll Shift. This user is playing both. Some people play Shieldred, some people play Sarah Paragon. So it's really trying to find what that secondary threat is. But I personally am really high on this deck for the RC. I'm going to be spending a lot of time tinkering and figuring out the list. But yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the best lockdown decks, and I think it's a good choice for your RC. All right, we've got over our usual runtime today, so that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. Thank you all, as always, for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, like the video, and until next week, adios.